From a distance, it looked like a slow, deliberate act of burial. An old woman, her back bent into a permanent question mark against the vast, unrelenting flatness of the plains, was methodically slicing into the earth. Her movements were not frantic or mad, but possessed the steady, rhythmic patience of geological time itself. She would drive a sharpened spade deep into the prairie, leveraging her slight weight to carve out a long, thick ribbon of turf. The grass on top was sun-bleached and coarse, but beneath, the soil was a dark, rich chocolate, bound together by a dense matrix of roots that had held this ground for centuries. She would then wrestle this heavy strip, nearly as long as she was tall, onto a crude wooden sled, her breath pluming in the crisp air. She would drag it, step by agonizing step, to the perimeter of a great, grey-timbered barn, the last proud structure on her lonely patch of land. There she would add it to the strange, low wall that was slowly, inexplicably, growing around the building's foundation. To anyone who might have crested the rise and seen this solitary tableau, the question would have been immediate and unsettling: what was she doing? Was this a fortress against a phantom enemy? Was it a bizarre rampart born of a mind cracked by isolation and grief? Or was she, in some final, mournful act of surrender, entombing the last remnant of her life, burying her past before the prairie could claim it for her? The wall itself defied logic. It was not stone nor wood, but living earth, stacked like bricks of sod, a creeping ring of green and brown that seemed to be growing out of the ground rather than being placed upon it. Her work was a silent, solitary sermon preached to an empty sky, a ritual whose purpose was known only to her. If you want to understand why a 70-year-old woman would undertake such a monumental, seemingly insane task, and how that wall of dirt and grass held the secret to surviving the unsurvivable, you must stay until the end. This story, however, isn't just about a wall. It is about a number. A single, solitary digit that would eventually be spoken in the hushed, reverent tones usually reserved for scripture. This number would silence the engineers, humble the proud, and rewrite the rules for building a life on the unforgiving plains. It was a number that lay dormant within the silent, stubborn heart of Adelaide's creation, waiting for the world to provide the equation it was meant to solve. Before that number could be revealed, there was only ridicule. There were the whispers in the new settlement 5 miles east, the place everyone else had gone when they abandoned this land. They called her the Sod Witch of Prairie Ridge, a cautionary tale told to frighten children and amuse cynical men in the town's only saloon. They spoke of her project not as an act of construction, but as one of decomposition, a woman slowly returning herself and her memories to the soil. The land agent who had tried to buy her out had filed a formal report, documenting what he called a hazardous, self-made earthwork, liable to catastrophic collapse. He noted her refusal to comply with the evacuation order, marking her down as a stubborn fool flirting with her own demise. Even her own kin, the last vestiges of her family, had given up. Her late husband's brother had made one final trip, his face a mask of weary pity, and had uttered the words that would echo in her mind during the long, silent months of labor: "Adelaide, you are chasing a ghost on a dying land. This place is finished. Let it go." But Adelaide heard a different truth, a whisper not from the ghosts of the past, but from the land itself. And so she continued to build, day after day, under the mocking sun, trusting in a wisdom that everyone else had forgotten. We will come back to that number, the one that proved her sanity, but first, we must understand the desperation that drove her to listen to the earth in the first place. The town of Prairie Ridge had died not with a bang, but with a dry, rasping whimper. For years, the diagnosis had been clear to everyone but Adelaide. The creek, once a reliable artery of life, had thinned to a muddy trickle and then vanished into the cracked soil entirely. The wells, dug with the sweat and hope of the first settlers, now brought up little more than bitter, alkaline sludge. The thin topsoil, overfarmed and stripped of the deep-rooted prairie grass that had anchored it, was beginning to lift away in the ceaseless wind, coating everything in a fine, gritty dust that got into the food, the water, and the lungs. It was a slow, grinding starvation of the land itself. The town council, a committee of pragmatic and defeated men, made the decision. They would move the entire settlement 5 miles east, to a plot near the Blackwater River, a place of deeper wells and more forgiving soil. It was a retreat, a surrender. They would dismantle what they could, abandon what they couldn't, and start over. For most, it was a painful but necessary choice. For Adelaide, it was unthinkable. Her husband, Michael, was buried in the small cemetery on the hill behind the barn, his grave marked by a simple fieldstone she had carried there herself. He had broken this land, poured his life into its furrows, and his bones had become part of it. To leave would be a betrayal far deeper than abandoning a failing farm, it would be abandoning him. The personal stakes were absolute, survival was tied not to a new location, but to this specific, sacred ground. When the official notice was posted, she ignored it. When the land agent came with his papers and his condescending offers, she showed him the door. When her brother-in-law, Thomas, arrived to plead with her, his voice laced with genuine concern, she stood firm. "This is my home, Thomas." "Michael is here," he had looked at her, his face etched with a profound sadness. "Michael is gone, Adelaide. And this place will be your grave if you stay. They've already sold the lumber rights for the abandoned structures. This whole town will be picked clean in a year. You will be utterly alone." His words were meant as a warning, but for Adelaide, they were a clarification. Alone was a price she was willing to pay. She would not prove him wrong with words, but with work. She would not fight the elements, she would partner with them. And as the last of her neighbors departed, leaving her in a silent world of empty buildings and howling wind, her resolve hardened not into bitterness, but into a quiet, unshakable purpose. The insight, the eureka moment, did not arrive in a flash of lightning or a stroke of divine inspiration. It came, as most true wisdom does, from quiet, patient observation. One sweltering afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive sun, Adelaide had taken a rest near a small, eroded bluff at the edge of her property. Her eyes fell upon the entrance to a badger's den, a simple, dark hole dug into the earth. She watched as the powerful animal emerged, its coat dusty but its demeanor untroubled by the heat. It disappeared inside again, and she felt a faint, cool breath of air emanate from the opening. She placed her hand on the soil around the den. The surface was hot to the touch, baked by the sun, but just an inch below, the ground was remarkably cool and slightly damp. The earth itself was a barrier, a moderator. She thought of the stories her grandfather used to tell, of the very first settlers on the plains, who didn't build with wood, a scarce and precious commodity, but with the very ground they stood on. They built sod houses, or through sod dyes, cutting the prairie turf into bricks. Those structures, he'd said, were cool in the summer and warm in the winter. The experts of her day, like Mr. Fletcher, the engineer who planned the new town, dismissed such methods as primitive and obsolete. Their thinking was all about rigid frames, precise angles, and milled lumber. They saw the prairie as an obstacle to be overcome, a foundation upon which to impose their superior, modern designs. They saw the wind as an enemy to be blocked by a tall, flat wall, a design that unknowingly turned their buildings into sails, catching the full force of every gale. Adelaide, in her moment of quiet contemplation, saw it differently. She saw the prairie not as a foundation, but as the building material itself. The flaw in the experts' thinking was their arrogance. They believed they could defeat nature with geometry and nails. Adelaide's insight was one of humility. She realized the only way to survive nature was to emulate it. The badger did not fight the earth, it used the earth. The deep-rooted prairie grass wasn't just a covering, it was a natural, fibrous reinforcement, a living mortar holding the soil in a bond far stronger than any man-made cement. Her barn, made of wood, was vulnerable. But if she wrapped it in the earth, if she gave it a thick, heavy hide of sod, it would cease to be a rigid object fighting the wind and would become a part of the landscape itself, as immovable and patient as the bluff the badger called home. The process was a grueling, solitary epic of labor, a testament to the power of human will against the inertia of old age and the indifference of the universe. Adelaide's day began before the sun, when the air was cool and the ground was soft with dew. Her primary tool was a tool of her own design, a cutting spade with a sharpened edge she meticulously maintained with a whetstone each evening. She wouldn't just dig randomly, she chose sections of prairie where the bluestem and buffalo grass grew thickest, knowing their root systems, some reaching down 5 or 6 feet, were the sinews that would give her bricks their strength. She would stomp the spade into the earth, using her entire body weight to sink it a foot deep. Then, with a practiced, rhythmic motion of her back and legs, she would carve a long, straight line. She'd make another parallel cut about 2 feet away, then score the ribbon of turf into 3-foot lengths. Each piece was a prairie brick, weighing between 50 and 80 pounds. The first lift was the hardest. She would have to pry the brick from the ground, a sound of tearing roots filling the silence, a sound like ripping thick canvas. Then came the transport. Using her crude sled, she would haul 2 or 3 bricks at a time on the slow journey to the barn. Her path became a deeply worn groove in the earth, a testament to her thousands of trips. The cost was measured not in money, but in sweat, in the permanent ache in her lower back, in the calluses that grew upon her calluses until her hands were like worn leather. She worked with the focus of a craftsman, laying the first course directly against the wooden foundation of the barn, grass side down. She packed the joints with a sticky clay slurry she mixed in a wheelbarrow, her hands caked in the mud. The second course was laid like a stonemason would, staggering the joints for strength. The wall grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, a few inches in height each day. It was a brutal, monotonous rhythm: cut, lift, haul, place. Repeat. The sun beat down on her, the wind tore at her bonnet, and the silence was broken only by her own ragged breathing and the scraping of her tools. There was no one to help, no one to encourage, only the internal voice of her brother-in-law, a constant whisper of doubt: "You cannot fight the whole world, Adelaide." But with every brick she laid, she wasn't fighting the world, she was joining it, building a partnership with the very ground everyone else had abandoned. The science behind Adelaide's wall was both ancient and profoundly elegant, a masterclass in physics that she understood not through equations but through instinct and observation. The core principle at play was thermal mass. Wood, the material her neighbors prized, has very low thermal mass. It heats up quickly in the sun and cools down just as fast at night, making the buildings bake in the day and freeze in the dark. Adelaide's sod wall, however, was a massive heat sink. Each 3-foot thick brick of earth could absorb a tremendous amount of solar energy throughout the day without its internal temperature changing significantly. At night, as the air temperature plummeted, the wall would slowly radiate that stored heat back into the barn, maintaining a stable, livable temperature. It was the same principle that makes a cave cool in the summer and protects animals hibernating through the winter. The second principle was tensile strength, provided by the dense web of grass roots within each brick. To the naked eye, it was just dirt. But on a microscopic level, those millions of tough, fibrous roots acted like a natural form of rebar, the steel rods used in modern concrete. They crisscrossed and interlocked, holding the soil together and preventing it from cracking or crumbling under pressure. This is what the engineer, Mr. Fletcher, failed to comprehend. He saw only loose earth and predicted a collapse from hydrostatic pressure during a rainstorm. He didn't see the internal, organic skeleton that gave the wall a resilient, almost flexible strength. Finally, and most critically, was the wall's response to the wind. A tall, flat, wooden barn wall is like a ship's sail. When a powerful gust of wind hits it, all that force is transferred directly to the building's frame, stressing the joints and threatening to tear it apart. Adelaide's wall worked on a completely different aerodynamic principle. It wasn't a vertical barrier, she had wisely sloped the outer face, creating a low, heavy, rounded berm. When the wind hit this structure, it didn't stop dead. Instead, the air flowed up and over it, much like water flowing over a smooth stone in a stream. The wall's immense weight, hundreds of tons of compacted earth, anchored it to the ground, while its shape deflected the wind's energy rather than absorbing it. It was less a wall and more a piece of low-lying topography, an unmovable feature of the landscape. It was a solution born of humility, one that didn't try to conquer the wind, but simply gave it no purchase. The conflict arrived on horseback, cloaked in the smug certainty of the conventional world. The first were the hecklers, young men from the new settlement who would ride out on Sundays for sport, to gawk at the old woman and her monument to madness. They would rein in their horses a safe distance away and shout their jeers, their voices carrying easily across the empty land. "Building your own tomb, old woman," one would boom, followed by the braying laughter of his companions. "The Gophers will thank you for the fine home," another would yell. Adelaide never looked up, never acknowledged them. Her silence seemed to infuriate them more than any angry retort could have. Her steady, rhythmic work was an answer in itself, a quiet rebuke to their fleeting noise. Then came the expert, Mr. Fletcher, the town engineer. He was not a malicious man, but one blinded by his own education. He dismounted and approached her with an air of professional concern, his gaze analytical as he surveyed her work. He began, his tone patient, as if explaining a complex problem to a child. I admire your industry, I truly do. But this design is fundamentally flawed. You have no foundation below the frost line and no system for drainage. The first hard rain will saturate this soil, and the resulting hydrostatic pressure will push your barn's foundation inward. It will collapse. It is a matter of physics. He spoke with the unshakable confidence of a man who trusts his textbooks more than his eyes. Adelaide paused, leaning on her spade, and looked at the thick, dark wall. The earth holds the rain, she said, her voice raspy from disuse. It has for 1,000 years. He simply shook his head and left, convinced he had done his duty. Finally, the authority figure arrived, Deputy Miller, a young man who wore his badge with an uncomfortable mixture of pride and unease. He carried a clipboard and a notice. Adelaide, he said, avoiding her eyes, I have to post this. It's from the county. They've declared this structure unsound and a public hazard. You're ordered to dismantle it. He tacked the paper to the barn door, the hammer blows echoing in the stillness. It was a formal, bureaucratic condemnation of her life's work. Her isolation was now complete, officially sanctioned. She was not just a holdout, she was a pariah, her sanity and judgment condemned by public scorn, expert opinion, and the rule of law. The gauntlet was not thrown down by any man, but by the sky itself. It began as a strange, unsettling stillness in the late afternoon. The air grew thick, heavy, and a sickly, greenish-yellow light bled across the horizon. The birds fell silent. The ceaseless prairie wind, for the first time in months, died completely, leaving an unnerving, expectant vacuum. Adelaide, her senses honed by a lifetime on the plains, knew the signs. She secured her milk cow and a few chickens inside the barn, latched the heavy wooden door, and then went into her small, adjacent sod house to wait. She did not pray for deliverance, she simply trusted in her work. Then it came. At first, it was a low rumble, a distant freight train where no tracks lay. The rumble grew into a deafening, visceral roar that shook the very ground. From the west, the sky turned black, and a monstrous, churning funnel cloud descended, a violent finger of God connecting the heavens and the earth. It moved with a terrifying speed, scouring the landscape, its path arbitrary and absolute. The narrative of its destruction was written in seconds. It struck the ghost town of Prairie Ridge first, and the abandoned wooden buildings that had stood for 50 years were obliterated, their lumber turned into a spray of deadly kindling. Then it moved east, directly towards the new settlement, the one built with Mr. Fletcher's modern designs and superior materials. The town's warning bell began to clang frantically, a tiny, desperate sound swallowed by the maelstrom. The tornado hit the new town not as a force, but as an unraveling. The neatly constructed houses and shops, designed to block the wind, instead caught its full fury. Roofs were peeled off like tin can lids. Walls exploded outward from the sudden drop in pressure. The entire town, the symbol of progress and sensible planning, was reduced to a field of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered dreams in less than a minute. The failure of conventional methods was total. Every nail, every precisely cut beam, every confident blueprint had proven utterly worthless against the raw, indifferent power of nature. As the monster passed, leaving a stunned, weeping silence in its wake, the only question that mattered was what, if anything, was left standing. The next morning, the world was remade in shades of grey and brown. A cold, steady rain fell from a bruised sky, washing the dust from the air and turning the wreckage of the new settlement into a sodden, heartbreaking morass. Mr. Fletcher, his face streaked with grime and his arm in a crude sling, moved through the ruins of his own creation like a ghost. His office, his home, the general store, all were gone, reduced to a foundation slab and a pile of debris. His blueprints, his confident calculations, were now just so much pulp scattered across the muddy fields. A hollow, desperate thought entered his mind, a need to see the final, predictable outcome of the old woman's folly. Perhaps seeing her failure would offer some perverse comfort, a confirmation that nothing could have withstood such a storm. He saddled the only horse he could find and began the 5-mile ride back to the old town, expecting to find nothing but a flattened mound of mud where Adelaide's barn once stood. He crested the final rise, his eyes scanning the horizon, and his breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. The landscape was scarred, pitted with debris, but there, solid and serene amidst the devastation, stood the barn. It was completely, impossibly, intact. And encircling it was the low, earthen wall, looking less like a man-made structure and more like a natural feature of the land, a bluff that had weathered 1,000 such storms. He slid from his horse and walked, then ran, toward it. He touched the wall. It was damp, scarred by impacts from flying debris, but it was profoundly solid, unbreached. He circled the entire structure, his engineer's mind racing, trying to process the data his eyes were giving him. He pushed open the heavy barn door. Inside, the air was calm and smelled of hay and livestock. Adelaide was there, quietly milking her cow, which chewed its cud with placid indifference. A few chickens pecked at the dirt floor. Nothing was out of place. This is where the number, the one that would silence everyone, was revealed. It wasn't a measure of wind speed or a complex calculation of force. It was simpler, more absolute. Mr. Fletcher looked up at the massive timber rafters, at the intricate joinery he knew so well. He looked for shifted beams, cracked trusses, any sign of the immense stress the building had endured. There was none. The number was 0. 0 inches of structural displacement. 0 rafters cracked. 0 roof boards missing. The barn had not merely survived, it had been untouched, protected inside its earthen armor. Fletcher turned to Adelaide, his voice a choked whisper. "How?" She finished her milking, stood up, and simply patted the thick sod wall beside her. "The earth holds," she said. And in that moment, the expert understood. His complex, rigid designs had shattered. Her simple, humble one had held. "You were right," he admitted, the words tasting of ash and awe. "We were all wrong." The legacy of Adelaide's wall began not with a monument or a plaque, but with a quiet pilgrimage. In the days and weeks that followed the great storm, the survivors of the new settlement began to drift back, not to the site of their ruined town, but to her farm. They came not to mock or to pity, but to learn. They saw her barn, a solitary island of order in a sea of chaos, and they understood. Mr. Fletcher was the first to ask for her guidance, his pride replaced by a desperate, humbling need for a wisdom that worked. He brought what was left of his plans, and together they sketched out new designs, not for tall wooden structures that defied the wind, but for low, sturdy homes braced and sheltered by the very earth they were built upon. The community, stripped of its resources and its arrogance, rediscovered the ancient knowledge it had so recently scorned. They learned to cut the prairie sod, to read the quality of the soil in the roots of the grass, to stack the bricks and seal them with clay. They worked together, their shared loss forging a new kind of bond, one built on the humble foundation of survival. They called the technique the Adelaide Brace, a name that spread through the territories as a synonym for resilience and common sense. Her farm became the heart of a new community, one that grew organically around the quiet truth her wall represented. The story of the lone, 70-year-old woman who built a fortress of dirt became a regional legend, a parable about the folly of pride and the power of listening to the land. Her quiet resolve had done more than save a barn, it had saved a people, giving them a blueprint for a future that was sustainable and secure. The ultimate lesson was not one of engineering, but of philosophy. True wisdom, they learned, is often found not in complex theories or new technologies, but in the simple, profound observation of the natural world. It is the courage to trust that observation, even when it is ridiculed by experts and condemned by authority. Adelaide's wall stands as a timeless reminder that the most powerful solutions are often the ones right beneath our feet, waiting for someone with the patience to see them and the courage to build. If her story has inspired you, consider subscribing for more tales of forgotten heroes and hidden wisdom. The greatest strength is often found where we least expect it.